Hi folks, I'm Craig Taylor, and as always, a huge thank you from me to you for taking the time to join me here on my YouTube channel, TheBushcraftPadawan. I was asked a week or two ago by a friend of mine on Facebook, a guy called Drew Wiley, hi Drew, if I could offer some advice to one of his clients, one of his customers, who was looking at going overseas and applying some map reading and land navigation whilst they were overseas. Drew said to me, I'll try and get more information from you, I'll try and get some more specifics. And I actually said no, actually thank you, but don't. Because I think there's some value in not being specific. I think there's some value to you watching this right now for me to just give some broad brush advice and caution around map reading and land navigating overseas without getting into specific countries or specific sectors and things like that. So I've drawn up a little list on my phone here, and I'm going to be referring to that if that's okay with you, because it's quite a lengthy list and I don't want to miss anything out. Before I do that though, let me just say that most of my navigation is done here in the UK using Ordnance Survey Great Britain maps, similar to what you see on the screen here. When I have operated overseas, most of the time that mapping that's been produced has been very similar to Ordnance Survey maps. It's often been done by the military geodesic, the military mapping service, the British one, and clearly they use a very similar convention to the Ordnance Survey Great Britain mapping. There's a very clear relationship between the two. So whilst it's overseas, it's a military map and it kind of feels very familiar. You can't usually go too far wrong with it if you're using British military maps overseas and you are indeed British yourself. That doesn't help you out though if you're a civilian going overseas and you're buying or borrowing or using local maps from overseas. Now, the example I'm giving is going from the UK or Great Britain overseas. The comparison is the same. Wherever your home country is, if you've navigated in that home country, you've gotten used to that system. You go somewhere else, even over to the UK, that system may look and feel different. And that's why I've drawn up a list here of things that you might want to consider before you go, before you book, before you start purchasing maps, and hopefully before you start putting your foot on the ground for the very first time in an overseas area. In no particular order. There's very likely to be a language difference between the maps. Now, some maps, overseas maps that I've seen, some foreign maps, have the local language on there and also include English because it's such a widely spoken language. That's a big assumption to make though. So make sure that you either look for maps that have your native tongue on them, or you become quite familiar with what that map is telling you in the local tongue of the country that it was producing. If you can't understand what is being said, what is being typed onto the map, you could be in for a real hardship. Units of measure. Most of the time I'm used to working in meters on Ordnance Survey maps. Sometimes I'll be used to working in miles. I can quite easily flick between the two. You may only work in one or the other. You go to a different country that uses a different unit of measurement and all of a sudden your distances will be different or wrong. Your height, elevation or gain or loss will be wrong. Your understanding of the shape of the land may be misleading because they all rely on you applying a known unit of measurement. If you don't know what that unit of measurement is, if you make assumptions based upon what it was back in your home country, you could be in for a real problem. The difference in terms of the relationship between grid north and magnetic north. Now, people call this different things. GMA, grid magnetic angle, magnetic declination, magnetic variation. They're all kind of talking subtly about the same thing. There's some subtle differences between them. Broadly, it's the same thing. If you're used to navigating in your country quite frequently with up-to-date maps, you'll be familiar with what that GMA, or magnetic declination, is. If you go overseas, that difference could be different first of all because, or it could be great first of all because you're in a very different part of the world. It could be different because you're using a very old mapping system, or it could be a very recent map, but the information that it tells you could be very old. So just be ultra aware and positively and confirm and reconfirm and triple confirm what the difference is between grid north and magnetic north on the map that you'll be using. What's the age of the map that you're going with? If you remember, and I'm going to link to it up here, I talk about several key things that you should look at when you pick a map up for the first time. Age is one of them. How old is your map? Even a map that I bought yesterday could technically be out of date today. A map that you've bought overseas that's 10 years old, because they don't refresh them very often, the older the map, the greater you are increasing the likelihood of it being inaccurate, because a map is a snapshot in time. The real world moves on, doesn't keep up to date with the map. The ground is always right. And then there's a few things that may not be the obvious things to think about. Here in the UK, very few parts of the UK have hunting with weapons and live ammunition taking place on them. Very few in comparison. Go overseas, in some places, that could be very different. That could be an inverse relationship. You could be straying into areas where people are hunting with live ammunition. Bear that in mind. What about local trouble spots overseas? Depending on your perspective, there are very few places in the UK that I would consider to be real trouble spots. Go overseas, you could be straying into some civil unrest, some civil conflict, a civil war. We all watch the news. There could be all sorts happening in your country, neighbouring countries. Things can flare up, so be aware of what's going on in the lead up to your deployment overseas or your trip overseas, and just take that into account as well. If you're not sure about going into an area, take sensible precautions. Maybe don't go through that area. In the UK, if you lose a map or you lose a compass, it can cause real problems. There's a real potential for serious problems if you lose those. It's easy to get a replacement though. If you can get back to safety, if you can get back to a village or a town, it's easy to get a replacement. That might not be the case overseas. So think about taking a spare compass, think about taking a spare map with you. It's something I do even here in the UK. If you're not used to doing that, I'd really advise taking spare kit with you. Not just because of the inconvenience of losing it and the immediate danger it can put you in, but also how and where are you going to buy a replacement for it? That could be a problem. A couple of other things as well. Think about the area of the world that you're going into in terms of the daylight. We're straying onto weather here, which should be a consideration for anyone, but think about the daylight that's available to you. Within the UK in the summer, you can get some quite long days out of that. Navigating, you can go for many, many hours before you need to think of stopping and setting up a camp. That might not be the case where you're going overseas. Days may be much, much shorter. And finally, also have a think that if you are going to use or rely upon, I would never rely upon it, but if you're going to incorporate some celestial or navigating by the stars into your repertoire while you're overseas, stars will be in a different place, if indeed even visible, depending on what part of the world that you go to. So if you're going to include that, and I definitely recommend, it's a great experience to do it alongside a map and compass, be aware of what constellations will be visible to you in your part of the world at the time of the year you're going. And clearly there's also a relationship with the sunrise and sunsets and angles and things like that, depending on where you are in the world. So I've rambled on there. I hope that whoever I was putting this together for on behalf of Drew, I hope you found it useful. I don't want to go into specifics because then it kind of becomes irrelevant to anybody else. But if you're the sort of person that is comfortable with navigating in your own country, wherever that is, just have a think about this video and some of the considerations that I've mentioned for when you go to another country or another part of the world. I know from personal experience that you can't just take what you know here in the UK and apply it. The principles of navigation stay the same. Unfortunately, the principles of navigation have a lot of variables in them. And the moment you start to move around the earth, those variables change. So please bear that in mind. If you found this video useful, if it's made you think about something, if it's made you remember something, or it's given you a kick up the butt to get out there with a map and compass, give me a thumbs up if you'd be kind enough. If there's anything you want to say about this, if there's anything that you think I've forgotten about, leave it in the comments below, either on Facebook or on YouTube. I'm sure other people would benefit from that. I'd benefit from that as well. If you want to share this with anyone, you know what to do with the share button, you know where it is. Go ahead, click away. And as always, if you're not yet a subscriber, and I'm so grateful for the people that are, but if you're not yet, do click that subscribe button. It's coming up in this corner of the screen about now. Click on there and you'll be kept up to date with any future videos that I released. A big thank you for watching, as always, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.